In 1904, the world is a place of competition among great empires, such as the United States, the European countries, and Russia. With most American countries already independent, the focus of colonization has shifted towards Africa and East Asia. There is no longer enough space for everyone to expand, leading to increasing tensions among the world's major powers. Uprisings, military campaigns, revolts, there are about 40 different conflicts occurring simultaneously across the world. At this time, several key events are unfolding around the globe that will shape its future. In the East, a war breaks out between an old and a new great empire. Europe takes another step towards forming alliances prior to World War I, while the United States officially adopts an interventionist policy in the Americas. At the beginning of the year, Britain is still carrying on its military expedition to Tibet, which had begun the previous year. At this time, the whole of Central Asia is subject to the so-called Great Game, a military and political competition between the Russian Empire to the north and the British Empire to the south. The region has a few semi-independent buffer states where the two great countries' interests overlap. One such state, Tibet, is technically part of the Qing dynasty. Yet the latter has been severely weakened, having suffered a defeat in the recent Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion, as well as foreign interventions. It is itself divided into spheres of influence and unable to properly secure its territory. Meanwhile, the border between British Sikkim and King Tibet is a subject of dispute. Fearing that the Russians might already be planning to take control of Tibet and to secure its interests, the British Indian armed forces use the dispute as a pretext and advance into Tibetan territory, heading towards its capital, Lhasa. On March 31st, a Tibetan force of 3,000 men stands in their way at Guru Heights. Despite both sides attempting to avoid conflict, a provocation leads to a clash. It becomes a brutal and tragic example of what happens when a professional army of highly experienced soldiers, equipped with machine guns and artillery, engages in battle against peasant conscripts armed with outdated rifles in open terrain. Up to 700 Tibetans are massacred, most of them while fleeing the battlefield. On the British side, only 12 men are wounded. Having advanced further, on May 5th, the Battle of Kerala takes place, which becomes probably the highest altitude battle in human history. During the next month, the British suffer a few sporadic attacks from the Tibetans, after which they march to Lhasa, only to find that its leader, the Dalai Lama, has fled. The remaining Tibetan authorities are forced into an agreement in his absence. On September 6, a treaty is signed that grants the British the privilege to trade in Tibet. The Tibetan government recognizes the border with Sikkim and is prohibited from establishing relations with other foreign countries. Additionally, a large indemnity must be paid to Britain. Until then, Britain will occupy the Chumbi Valley. With that, China's protectorate over Tibet is questioned by Tibetans, ultimately leading to an uprising against Chinese authority the following year. Russia has pursued an expansionist policy for hundreds of years. Confined in the West by powerful empires and facing competition from Britain in the South, it still sees expansion opportunities in the East. Russia needs direct access to warm Pacific waters for its fleet, which most of its territories do not provide. To this end, it leased Port Arthur from China in 1898 for 25 years, and the two made an agreement allowing Russia to build a railroad on Chinese territory, connecting its city of Chita with Vladivostok and Port Arthur. Additionally, its troops have been present in Chinese Manchuria since its invasion of China during the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. Russia promised to withdraw them, but never did so. Finally, it has an eye on Korea, looking to draw it into its sphere of influence and even starts building infrastructure there. Nevertheless, Russia's grip on these lands is tenuous, and it's contested by another rising power, Japan. Japan's economic and military influence is increasing in the region. It wants Korea and parts of China as markets for its growing production. The strategic Port Arthur, as well as the entire Liaodong Peninsula, was controlled by Japan before being transferred to Russia in 1898. Thus, the two countries' interests oppose each other. For a few years, they attempt to negotiate over Korea and Manchuria. Japan offers Russia control over Manchuria in exchange for that over Korea. However, this is unacceptable to Russia, as it would cut off Port Arthur from Vladivostok. Despite its growing economic and military power, Japan, as an Asian country, is still seen as racially inferior by European nations, including Russia. It is widely believed that no Asian power could stand against a European army. Japan's military defeat in the event of war seems inevitable, reinforcing Russia's dismissive stance towards Japanese warnings. By 1904, tensions reached their peak, fueled by Russia's continued military presence in Manchuria, its refusal to negotiate territorial concessions, and Japan's growing impatience. A military conflict becomes inevitable. Despite Russia's numerical superiority over Japan, most of its army is deployed near its western borders in Europe, a month's journey away from its eastern territories. On February 8th, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur while simultaneously landing its troops in Korea. In a few battles, both sides suffer heavy losses. Marking a significant shift in power, the Battle of Yalu River becomes the first battle in decades won by an Asian army against a European one. The Japanese take the upper hand. They besiege Port Arthur and manage to push the Russian army back in Manchuria. The Russian fleet attempts to evacuate from Port Arthur to Vladivostok, but after encountering the Japanese fleet, it has to return and wait for reinforcement from other Russian fleets. Only by October, the Russian Baltic Squadron is finally ready to set off for Port Arthur. Yet the northern route is not navigable at the time, and the Suez Canal is closed to Russian passage by the British due to the Anglo-Japanese Alliance Treaty of 1902. Thus, the fleet must take the southern route, which will take as long as 8 months. Passing through the North Sea on its way, the squadron encounters several vessels, which it mistakenly identifies as Japanese torpedo boats hiding in ambush. The squadron opens fire at what turns out to be British trawlers. The incident nearly ignites a war between Russia and Britain and causes a diplomatic row. After a later investigation, Russia will pay compensation to Britain. Meanwhile, the Russian army in the east finds itself in a desperate position and makes attempts to delay engagement while waiting for its reserves. The decisive battles of this war, culminating in Russia's defeat, will take place the following year. Europe experiences intense political rivalry among the great powers. Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy have had an alliance since 1882, called the Triple Alliance. On its part, their opponent, France, has been allied with Russia since 1894. Looking for additional security and powerful allies, by 1904, France managed to resolve its differences with Great Britain. On April 8th, the two countries signed a few agreements that include some bilateral concessions regarding spheres of influence. Despite not being an official military alliance, it still creates a closer relationship between Britain and France, with the latter becoming a connecting link between the two rivals, Russia and Britain, who will sign their own treaty in 1907. Meanwhile, German colonial ambitions in Africa continue to grow. By this time, Germany firmly controls territories in various parts of Africa, including German Southwest Africa. This colony is inhabited by several indigenous groups, primarily the Herero people, whose livelihoods depend heavily on cattle herding and open grazing lands. But the settlers systematically seize vital pasture lands, pushing the Herero into harsh, arid regions. Local people are subjected to forced labor, heavy taxation, and severe exploitation, fueling deep resentment and tensions. By January 1904, hostility reaches a breaking point. Chief Samuel Maharero calls for an uprising, and the Herero people rebel, attacking German settlements and driving settlers out. Germany responds swiftly by sending reinforcements under General Lothar von Trotha, notorious for his brutality. After decisively defeating the rebels, he issues the infamous extermination order, instructing his forces to kill or expel all Herero, irrespective of age or gender. Thousands are forced into the desert, intentionally deprived of water and resources, and left to perish. The German authorities also conduct medical experiments and implement harsh concentration camps, further devastating the population. By the end of 1904, tens of thousands of Herero have died or fled, making this campaign one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Only more than a century later does Germany officially acknowledge responsibility, classifying these events as genocide and agreeing to pay reparations to Namibia. The United States is cementing its influence in Central America and the Caribbean after the end of the Spanish era in the region. To this end, it regularly conducts political, economic, and military interventions in other countries. Some of these countries, such as Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica, are heavily dependent on fruit exports. In fact, much of their economies is controlled by US corporations, such as the United Fruit Company. In 1904, in his book Cabbages and Kings, O. Henry, an American writer, uses the phrase "banana republic" to describe a fictional country rife with corruption, political instability, and impoverishment, inspired by Honduras. Soon enough, this becomes a common political term, and the US policy of conducting interventions and occupations in such countries will come to be called the Banana Wars. During this period, the US fleet constantly patrols Caribbean waters, sometimes even engaging in local conflicts. Meanwhile, the country takes over the Panama Canal Zone as a result of the previous year's events, initiating the construction of the Panama Canal. At this time, the Dominican Republic is in a dire economic state after years of political instability. Heavily indebted to European powers, it becomes a potential target for their intervention. The US realizes the necessity of securing its interests and future trade routes and preventing any European countries from interfering in the region's affairs. To this end, in December, President Roosevelt declares a significant change in US foreign policy in Central and South America, known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It states that the US can now intervene in countries' internal affairs, officially to maintain order and stability, as well as to prevent European interventions. In just a few weeks, in early 1905, the US will take control over the Dominican Republic's economy and manage its debt repayment, thus cutting off European countries from influencing in the region. In Uruguay, the governing liberal Colorado's party is contested by the conservative Blancos. Since the nation's independence, these groups have periodically engaged in violent conflict, competing for political control and influence. In January 1904, the Blanco leader Aparicio Saravia mobilizes an armed uprising against the Colorado government, accusing it of electoral fraud and authoritarianism. The conflict quickly escalates into a full-scale civil war, as Saravia's forces, initially gaining popular support among rural communities, pose a substantial challenge to the government's authority. Over several months, fierce battles erupt throughout Uruguay, significantly disrupting the nation's economic and social life. Despite initial military successes, Saravia suffers a severe defeat at the Battle of Massaler in September, where he is mortally wounded. His death effectively signals the collapse of the revolution, leading to the Blanco faction's surrender. As the bloodiest civil conflict in the country's history, the revolution becomes a historical turning point for Uruguay. The defeat of the Blancos begins an extended period of relative political stability, consolidating the state and paving the way for modernization and reforms. Brazil is rapidly modernizing and urbanizing, with Rio de Janeiro serving as its bustling capital. Yet this modernization outpaces the city's infrastructure and healthcare capabilities and is accompanied by serious health crises, particularly epidemics of yellow fever, smallpox, and plague. In response, the Brazilian government launches a comprehensive public health campaign, including mandatory smallpox vaccinations. Although intended to improve public health, the vaccination campaign faces strong opposition from the local population. Residents distrust the authorities, fearing compulsory vaccinations as intrusive and dangerous. Rumors spread rapidly that vaccinations might cause illness or even death. Tensions boil over in November, when widespread protests erupt across Rio de Janeiro, quickly escalating into violent riots known as the Vaccine Revolt. The city experiences street battles, looting, and destruction, forcing the government to deploy troops to restore order. After several days of unrest, authorities regain control, arresting hundreds of people and suspending mandatory vaccination. Despite being quickly suppressed, the aftermath of the revolt reveals deep-seated public distrust towards government measures. Although it serves as an important lesson on the necessity of public education about vaccination, the issue will re-emerge on a worldwide scale over a century later, during the COVID-19 pandemic. As the birthplace of football, Britain has its home championship between its four football associations: the English, the Scottish, the Welsh and the Irish. But the game is becoming increasingly popular in other countries. International matches become regular, and the need for a centralized governing body becomes obvious to regulate common rules, resolve disputes and coordinate tournaments. Then, representatives from a few European football associations approach England, seeking its leadership and participation in forming this new global institution. However, the English Football Association declines the invitation, preferring to maintain autonomy over its own rules and competitions. This does not stop the other countries, and on May 21st, representatives from the football associations of France, Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden and Switzerland, as well as Madrid Football Club from Spain, gather in Paris to formally establish the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, or FIFA. That same day, they are joined by Germany. England and Scotland's associations will still join in the following year, yet the original French name and abbreviation will remain in place for good. Over the following decades, FIFA will evolve into one of the world's largest sporting organizations, responsible for creating and governing the World Cup, an event uniting billions of fans and transforming football into the most popular sport on the planet. That was 1904. It has seen some significant strategic and military developments. In 1905, this trend will continue, further reshaping the world.